Corbyn, in a way, was never comfortable in that role of the hyper leader. The only reason he has agreed to set up this party, which he was initially reluctant to do, is because the demand from popular forces has been so overwhelming and the need for it has been so objectively clear. I think the problem, though, is that leadership remains extremely important to sort of sum up this disparate range of struggles and to translate it into something politically coherent.
Your party has currently 50,000 members. Was suggested in a recent poll that it could win up to 13 seats if an election happened now, but it seems to be still having a difficult start. What is the window of opportunity, and can your party take it, and can it recover from that difficult start?
Well, I think this is probably at once the best and also the worst week to be releasing a book about your party. The wrangling between the two factions at the top of the party over its financial situation continues with briefings and counter-briefings and legal threats and so on. And obviously that's hugely demoralizing for all the people who had high hopes for this party, myself included. But also this week we've seen another vicious factional war play out at the top of the Labour Party, with briefings against Wes Streeting from Downing Street, and then a campaign against Starmer's sort of chief attack dog, Morgan McSweeney. And so I think we need to sort of set these two things side by side when we're thinking about the potential for your party at our present political moment. I mean, the Labour Party under Starmer is, a sort of husk of reaction. It has very little positive vision of change, of progress. It's not animated by any of the sort of optimism or, the sort of free market fantasies of Blairism the first time round. It's a sort of new and much more, in a way, traditionally sort of conservative form of new Labourism that we're seeing now, which is simply about retrenchment, about repression, about lowering people's political expectations and encouraging them to accept the state of decline that this country can't seem to escape from. And what happens when a party has so little, political imagination is that it then falls victim to the kinds of, personal power struggles that we're right now seeing play out in Downing Street. It erodes its credibility. It opens the door to forces who are offering either sort of a sort of simulacrum of opposition like the far right, or offering a sort of real alternative, which was at least the promise of your party. So I think the political space remains open because of the state of the Labour Party. But then at the same time, you've had this persistent infighting within your party, which has so far prevented it from occupying that space. And I think it's not enough to just, pick sides or decide which faction we're going to throw our weight behind. I think the factionalism is itself a kind of structural problem with your party. What this organization is trying to do is to unite an extremely fractured and extremely disparate left that exists, in a series of disconnected campaign groups, sort of small far-left organizations, labor struggles, tenant struggles, and so on. And to bring these forces together in a completely historically unprecedented formation like your party was always going to be a very fraught endeavor, in part because there's no clear way to decide who has the authority to make decisions about the structure of this new party. There's no clear way to decide who has a sort of decision-making mandate. And I think when we're looking at the split that's emerged between Corbyn and Sultana, what we really have are kind of two different claims to legitimacy. Zara Sultana has kind of styled herself as a representative of the base, the membership, the kind of cadre, whereas Corbyn and his team see their legitimacy as based on having a sort of mass appeal, having, won 13 million votes in the 2017 election and sort of reaching people beyond the base, as it were, beyond people who are already sort of politicized in that way. So I think that's just one way of understanding the sort of clash that so far sort of diminished your party's chances of success. I think its chances of recovery are based on whether it can, bring together that sort of appeal to the base and that broader appeal to the nation, whether it can sort of harmonize those things and turn them into a sort of mutually reinforcing political dynamic rather than the current situation in which they're sort of tearing each other apart.
We seem to be in a third moment in the history of how the relationship between the party and the movement, or the party and the broader political ecology, are thought. The first moment having been the moment when it was assumed that there were a number of political functions, including theoretical elaboration, the elaboration of strategy, political socialization, and political education, and so on, that had to be concentrated in a single form that was the party. Then a second movement, a more horizontalist movement, where people just assumed or tried to convince themselves that it was possible to do away with all these functions altogether. And now a sort of resituating of the party in which it is recognized that some functions are still better served by a party form, but this doesn't mean that all those functions need to be concentrated in the party, and they can instead be distributed, or it's important that they are fulfilled, but they can be fulfilled if they are distributed within a political ecology. But there are two functions, at least, or maybe one function that we can break down into two separate aspects, that it's definitely the case that the party is better suited as a political form to fulfill. And this is the function of electoral representation broadly, but as you said, electoral representation breaks down into the representation of an organized base on the one hand, and on the other hand, a representation of the unorganized people, which is the more mediatic function that the party plays in terms of speaking to those who aren't yet organized, who aren't who don't yet agree with the party and aren't even necessarily politicized. And among the people you interviewed for the book, it seems to be only James Schneider and Andrew Feinstein, to a lesser extent, who appear to have a clear vision of who this second constituency, the broader constituency, would be. So James Schneider says the asset-poor working class, the downwardly mobile graduates, and racialized communities. And Feinstein says historical working class bases, petty bourgeois attracted to the far right, middle-class activists mobilizing against status quo, abstentionists who have disengaged from politics. So from this, I have a set of questions. The first one being, are these the only visions, or have you come across other visions within the party? Secondly, how do these visions compare to the coalition built by Corbynism? And how could such a coalition now have a different fate from the one built by Corbynism had? And specifically, in relation, this is something that Feinstein touches on directly, specifically how to, when speaking to the unorganized, how to get some of the disaffected vote that Feinstein refers to in an alliance with groups that are presently pitted by the far right as being on the other side of the culture wars?
Yeah, well, it's a difficult question. I mean, I think James Schneider's summary of the groups that could form a social majority for this new party is a succinct one when he talks about asset poor workers, downwardly mobile graduates, and racialized communities as three non-mutually exclusive categories to which we could be trying to appeal. Um, I think that maybe one category that's left out there is, gender as a sort of politically important aspect of Corbynism's near success during the 2015 to 2019 period. The female vote for Corbyn's Labour was much stronger than the male vote, and I think that speaks to a dynamic of, you know, the erosion of the welfare state and its effect on social reproduction, and the extent to which Corbynism the first time round was a coherent program for sort of solving some of those social crises that are experienced more acutely by women. So I think that's also something that could be sort of put at the forefront of our political strategy. How would the approach of this party towards sort of the current British electorate differ from that of Corbynism the first time round? Well, I think the importance of those racialized communities can't be overstated in a context where, Starmerism imposes a state of permanent austerity that, again, has disproportionate effects on those areas. Starmerism also funds a genocide in Gaza that is a particular sort of flashpoint for many of those people who have long been, had families, had connections to places that have been ravaged by imperial war. And at the same time, those communities are also facing this onslaught from reform, enabled and facilitated by the government's increasingly racist clampdown on migrants. And so I think these dynamics sort of combine to mean that we the constituencies that independents have already won in, the constituencies where your party could potentially win in 2029, have these communities which have often kind of banded together by necessity to protect themselves from these headwinds, which are increasingly intense. And I think when we come to, the discussion of the culture war, this is sort of very important because what your party needs to do is create a political culture that's rooted in those communities. And I think if it does that, then some of these divisions that we've seen so far about, trans issues, some of the issues that have been used to try and divide, say, Zoran Mamdani's base in New York over police funding, that kind of thing. I think those issues are salient when we're fighting on the terrain of the center and the right. But I think the hope of your party, and it's a hope that remains alive despite all the problems we've mentioned, is that it can create a sort of deep political culture in which some of those divisions are much less salient, much less significant, and where people might not necessarily agree with your party's progressive platform, when it comes to every single question, but they will have a sort of deep affinity with the party because they know that it is their party. It's the only one that's willing to defend them in these increasingly hostile times.
Well, on the question of leadership, I think we need to start by differentiating kinds of leadership, where we have one axis, let's say, which would be institutional power, and another which would be charismatic, inspirational leadership. So if we compare Corbyn to other, or we compare Corbyn Mark I to other experiences that were taking place at more or less the same time, we could say that, for example, we have Pablo Iglesias and Jean-Luc Mélenchon on one side as examples of people who have both things. They have or had institutional power over their parties, and they offered a charismatic, inspirational model of leadership. On another side, you have someone like Starmer, who's someone with a lot of institutional power over his party, but who doesn't really provide any inspirational leadership. He's someone who doesn't so much lead as just inch. And then finally, you have the cases of Sanders and Corbyn then, which were examples of people who provided inspirational leadership but didn't have the institutional control over their parties. And here there is a certain tension between the two representative functions, representing the organized base and representing the unorganized people, in the sense that for the organized base, an inspirational leader who's institutionally weak may be more interesting because it means that he or she are more beholden to their base. They are constrained to listen more and to take a more democratic or more grassroots-led approach. So the first question here would be, one of the ways of reading all the factional infighting that's been taking place at the head of your party at the moment is that maybe Corbyn and the group or the group around him are trying to be something else now, i.e. To have that institutional control. Is that tied to any particular vision of the party, or is it just an exercise in trying to wrestle control and maybe compensate precisely for the trauma of Corbyn Mark I when they didn't have this power and they paid dearly for it? And is there anything apart from electoral calculus among the people who support him as the sole leader of the party, i.e. the fact that he's obviously the one with the greater recall, he's the one who's better known by the public, or is there any other vision of both what his leadership and the relationship with the base, the relationship with the party should be?
Well, I suppose during the 2010s, you had these various left populist experiments, which, although they had particularities depending on their different national contexts, they all conformed to this broad idea of the charismatic leader who would, as you say, inspire the otherwise kind of unactivated, unmediated masses, to the extent that they would at least turn out to vote for these electoral alternatives. If there was a recognition that on the very compressed timescale of the 2010s, when these parties often outperformed expectations, got very close to government, and then needed to get over the line, they didn't have the time to rebuild working class culture, to reconstitute the working class as a class for itself. But they did perhaps have the time to galvanize enough people through the use of, a slick communication strategy to simply get them into power, at which point it was thought, once they were in power, they could sort of use the levers of the state to begin that much bigger task of building real popular power. That experiment didn't work really in any of the places where it was tried. As it turned out, although they were working on a very short electoral timescale, often people's political commitments sort of operate on an even shorter timescale, and those who were initially inspired or enthused by these left populist leaders, then kind of lost interest a few years later. And there were very few durable forms of institutional power that could then keep them interested and committed to the project of the left. So I think your party is trying to learn from that unfortunate historical experience, and Corbyn, in a way, was never comfortable in that role of the hyper leader, and now in this new guise, he's trying to play a different role that he's actually better suited to, which is that of the sort of the figurehead who is a reference point for many of these local organizations, these sort of community groups and so on, that know what he represents politically and that identify with it, but who at the same time are not necessarily looking for a clear kind of direction from him. If anything, the political relationship is the other way around, where the only reason he has agreed to set up this party, which he was initially reluctant to do, is because the demand from popular forces has been so overwhelming and the need for it has been so objectively clear, that it's a response from him rather than a sort of a decree. So there is that difference between Corbynism initially and Corbynism now. I think the problem, though, is that leadership remains extremely important to sort of sum up this disparate range of struggles and to translate it into something politically coherent. And that's an aspect of this project that I think really has been lacking. It can't always be the case that you're just conducting an endless sort of listening exercise where you respond to the needs of your members or constituents. In fact, I mean, what kind of politics is that? It comes close to the politics of Starmerism, which is obviously obsessed with listening exercises, focus groups, which, claims not to have a sort of clear set of ideological investments of its own, but rather wants to sort of meet working people where they're at. I think there's a real danger of the left adopting a similar kind of overly modest, overly humble kind of politics that's leaderless, that tries to be sort of ultra democratic, and that as a result, can't keep its forces together. And of course, they're not together, as we've seen just over the past week. They're very much at each other's throats.
Given the struggles for control of the party so far, and the tendency for a certain control freakery on the side of some of the factions at the top of the party, will the vision be the party is really just a catalyst that provides resources and training and doesn't try to control organizations? Or do you think it will revert to something more like, well, grassroots organizing and base building is only ever tied to electoral politics and always finds a limit in the fact that it's subordinate to that strategy?
I think in the book there are sort of two different conceptions of the relationship between popular power and parliamentary power, and how you could institutionalize that relationship in a party. On the one hand, yes, James's analysis is that if the fundamental problem of the left is the erosion of civil society, then the best thing that the party could do would be to sort of reconstitute and rebuild civil society in some way, and that the task of winning elections is fundamentally downstream from that other task of creating the social foundation on which to both win elections and then sort of implement a set of progressive policies once you've won them. That's one sort of conception of the party's relationship to popular power. The other comes from Andrew Murray, who's also I interviewed for the book, who thinks that to expect your party to play this role of being the kind of central node in a vast series of different initiatives to build sort of grassroots strength, would be to greatly sort of overburden the party, and that in fact, there's not really any contradiction between an electoral focus and the hope of sort of reactivating subaltern classes on a wider scale. Andrew Murray would argue that if the party becomes a credible and effective electoral opposition, that will sort of almost spontaneously give these wider popular forces inspiration and also give them a set of finite campaigns around which to rally. So I think, deciding between these two visions is not easy. And there's a kind of paradox in that, Schneider's outlook could be described as kind of more movementist, but also, I suppose, you can't have huge kind of faith in the organic or spontaneous power of social movements if you think you need a national party to sort of stimulate them or to sort of set up, institutions of popular power. That's a very kind of like anti-spontaneous vision of social movements. Whereas on the other hand, Andrew Murray has a very kind of electoralist focus, and yet his electoralist focus relies to an extent on the idea that social movements will just spontaneously, organically spring up as long as there is a party that's sort of fighting for parliamentary power. So I think there's a real sort of paradox to work through here. Also, I stressed the importance of leadership earlier, and from that perspective, we do obviously need an organization that's not only sort of trying to support the existing kind of community leaders who could plausibly win elections in 2029, but that's also cultivating new leaders and actively engaged with the kinds of local struggles where leaders are organically formed. I think whether you see the party's role as a sort of grassroots organization or whether you see its role as kind of fighting on a higher political terrain, that kind of leadership identification and cultivation is a very important aspect of its role. I also think that some of the hostility towards the people who have been involved in organizing your party is prone to overstate the difference between these perspectives. I mean, Jeremy himself is, as well as being an internationalist, is like the preeminent kind of local politician, and that's partly why it was so easy in a way to re-elect him by a landslide margin in Islington North, because everyone knows him both as this sort of standard bearer of the international left, but also as the person who saved the local hospital, the person who turns up at every community event. And I think that's the same with many of these other MPs in the Independent Alliance. They are really seen as both, sort of fearless advocates of the Palestinian cause in particular, while also being deeply embedded in their areas, in their neighborhoods. And so, I think that fusion of the sort of the local and the international is sort of a huge part of your party's orientation from the very beginning. And surely that's precisely the orientation that a lot of these sort of proto-factions, proto-tendencies within your party want to see. I think, naturally, there's been some defensiveness on the part of Corbyn's team. They've obviously been through this traumatic historical experience of kind of letting people into the fold and then those people sabotaging the project and it coming apart at the seams. So there's a degree of sort of guardedness and defensiveness about not wanting that to happen again. And I think it's right to criticize that defensiveness when it becomes, sort of overly defensive. But on the other hand, I think clearly what Corbyn and his team genuinely want is a party that, sort of has a close relationship to local organizing. The founding documents of your party specifically, set out a set of proposals for how the central organization would relate to local organizations, and suggest, giving them all the resources they need to win these battles at the level of sort of everyday life, at the level of the street rather than Westminster. So, I think that we should avoid sort of creating the impression of division over these questions where division doesn't actually exist. On the other hand, we all need to collectively work through these extremely difficult questions of how you go about creating popular power in a social landscape where it's been systematically eroded. And I think that's something that the book, tries to start doing.
You laid out those two extreme positions, the more movementist, which, as you said, ironically argues for a stronger role for the party, and the more party center, which ironically turns out to be the more movementist position, in the sense that it expects that base building will just happen of its own accord. So on the one hand, James Schneider, on the other hand, Andrew Murray. Do you think there is a balance between these two positions at the top of your party?
In the wake of the failure of the war of maneuver, if that's how we want to put it, in 2019, obviously there was a sort of mass shift towards a war of position. I suppose the thing about that is that it can take forever. You can build the base forever. And it's notable that, all the sort of community initiatives that people poured their efforts into from 2019 onward haven't really generated the kind of mass political culture on which a successful sort of contestation of state power could take place. Instead, the basis for this new party is sort of two separate, kind of more recent wars of maneuver. One is the Palestine movement, which had elements of it, sabotaging weapons factories and so on, which were sort of a literal war of maneuver, and which also was a very sort of rapid coming together of many different forces to apply maximal pressure on politicians to change their disastrous and genocidal policy. That was one part of the foundation for your party. The other was then the victories of the independent candidates in 2024, which were also, last-minute snap election campaigns. Those were local wars of maneuver. Obviously, they were built on a foundation of community power, which had been built up, if you want to put it that way, through a kind of war of position. But I think the fact that those two developments created the conditions of possibility for your party, which in turn creates the conditions of possibility for a real national sort of left alternative to the status quo, shouldn't be neglected. We shouldn't say that just because the war of maneuver failed in the 2010s, now our task and the task of the party must be the war of position. As you say, there is a relationship between these two things. There needs to be a proper sort of balance between them. And one benefit of having a highly coordinated national party that's democratic and therefore can respond and adapt to changing political circumstances is that it can decide what the balance is. I think we don't necessarily need to, in the abstract, sort of come up with the perfect equation there, but we can come up with a set of party structures that allow us to respond in real time to these competing imperatives of, the two Gramscian approaches. I guess then to say how this might apply to the Greens, I mean, it's undeniable that a lot of the sort of ebbing away of confidence in your party has then been of great benefit to the Greens, whose membership numbers have soared, and whose leader, Zach Polanski, is, filling this political void to a large extent with his much more antagonistic, sort of class-based approach to Green politics. I don't really buy some of the criticisms of the Green Party that people on the left make when people say it's too middle class to succeed in working class constituencies. When people say that its profile is just fundamentally not the right one for a sort of insurgent left project, I think that sounds to me a bit defeatist, and it also sounds to me quite similar to what many people on the right would say about your party's chances of success. You can obviously take a snapshot of sort of polling in any given situation and use that to claim that, of course, no one would ever vote for a socialist party or for the Green Party, and that removes the sort of element of, I guess, contingency and organization from politics, which is what we're supposed to all believe in, that we can actually change these things by organizing collectively, that we don't have to accept what the pollsters tell us as the inevitable reality. So I on that basis, I really support this transformation of the Green Party that's underway. And I think if people in Britain are living in a constituency where the Greens are the alternative to Labour, and where it's unlikely that a Your Party kind of project is going to really cut through, I would absolutely think that the Greens should be supported as the alternative and the challenger to the Labour Party. On the other hand, I guess when it comes to these questions of the balance between the war of position and maneuver, the balance between popular and parliamentary organizing, what we're talking about when we discuss all of these vexed questions is really how we want to go about creating kind of new socialist subjects, how we want to instill a deep sort of commitment to socialist politics that will be able to withstand all the sort of strengths of the right in communicating their politics. They have social media, they have legacy media, they have sort of roving street gangs, and now they have hundreds of thousands of people on the street in Whitehall. These are the forces we're up against, and so our response to that can't be simply kind of effective political messaging or sort of good progressive policies, although both those things are necessary as well. It also needs to be this attempt to create a sort of socialist worldview that is a genuine antidote and a sort of lasting antidote to the politics of the far right. And my one sort of hesitation about the Green Party, and which then also turns into a reason for a sort of cautious optimism about your party, is that is even the most radical wing of the Green Party truly interested in creating that kind of worldview on a mass scale, or is it more that it has a series of good policies that obviously sort of resonate with people, that would, of course, make people's lives better, and it has a charismatic leader who can communicate those policies over the airwaves. I mean, both those things are great, and British political culture is enhanced by having both those things. But this sort of, politics proper might be a slightly different question, which maybe your party could work through.
Could you summarize a little bit the positions on the party organizational form that are present at the moment, whether it should be a unitarian or a federated party? A little bit in the book comes through on the relationship with branches or the selection of party leadership. Could you give us more or less a lay of the land of the debates as they exist so far?
Certainly. Well, I mean, before the sort of personal polarization between Jeremy and Zara really took root, there was, in a way, a more substantive debate going on about organizational form, whether the new party should be a more federal structure that tries to link together the range of different local groups and left-wing organizations that we mentioned earlier, and acts as a sort of loose coalition that can support them, but that doesn't play a sort of a highly interventionist role in each of them and allows them their own sort of distinct and particular identities, or whether we should be striving for a more unitary party that precisely tries to take this vast range of different forces and turn them into something, truly coherent, a kind of singular, unified bloc that can then advance, the cause of the left in a way that none of these local groups could do by themselves, something that's like bigger than the sum of its parts. So this was a question that was discussed, among the figures on the organizing committee who were in discussions to set up the new party. That organizing committee was then wound down after the hostilities between the leadership figures came out into the open. And these, kind of fundamental questions have then been somewhat eclipsed by these much more superficial ones about who the leader is, or who the co-leaders are. So, I mean, that's in one way a great shame. However, there's a kind of, halfway solution that's been proposed in the party's founding documents, which suggest that for the first 2 years of its existence, it will have a federated structure, and then after 2 years, it will switch to unitary. So in that period of time, each of these different groups needs to sort of work out what relation it wants to have to your party. And there will hopefully be an ongoing process of kind of democratic deliberation, which ends up deciding what it means to be a sort of a your party branch. I think inevitably a lot of this does need to play out sort of in practical politics on the ground. Again, it's kind of you can speculate too much on ideal models when in fact the model for the Camden branch of your party might be very different to the ideal model for the sort of Hartlepool branch or whatever. So I think some of this will play out, and hopefully once we've sort of moved past some of this factionalism, these questions can then be sort of tabled once again. The problem, though, is that it's precisely as we said before, because of the fragmented state of the left, that factionalism takes root. And, there's a kind of sort of double trap here, a sort of catch-22, in that a federated model does very little to sort of heal that fragmentation and potentially allows for different groups to go in different directions, which then, can't really be contained in one single organization. A unitary model tries to heal it, but in so doing, would it, actually just expose these sort of deep contradictions between different sides of the left? And in trying to bring them together, would their divisions be sort of more apparent than ever?
Finally, to close this conversation, we have had a good success story recently, which was Mamdani's election in New York. And I was wondering if you know anything about how that has been received within your party and what you think your party could learn from Mamdani's success.
Absolutely. Well, I was in New York for Mamdani's victory, and I think there's a lot we could learn from it. I mean, at the level of the program and the media strategy, you have a relentless sort of message discipline, a focus on cost of living questions, but beyond that, a series of very simple, implementable policies, which nonetheless, expand the sort of realm of political imagination. And I mean, I started off by saying that Starmerism is really an attempt to sort of lower people's political expectations. What Mamdani has done with these policies is just really sort of expand and broaden them in a very effective way. So while they're, on the one hand, policies that I'm sure, well, he'll have to override a lot of resistance, but there are very few budgetary constraints. They are well within the realm of political realism. They also kind of change people's conceptions of what is realistic. And I think that your party's program should try to do something similar. Of course, then Mamdani also is a product of a broader mass socialist organization, the DSA, which knows how to sort of find leaders like him, people with incredible communicative abilities, and sort of bring them to the fore and encourage them to take on these roles. DSA is at once, sort of has models of community organizing that are also very kind of tech savvy in a way that we don't really have here. I think there's a lot to be learned from that. And also, I mean, I saw a particular side of it when I was over there, but it's also not at all kind of anti-intellectual, as well as being very sort of practical and focused. There have been a lot of people who have been having endless conversations with different left municipal administrators. They've reached out to Corbyn's team over here to ask them about their experience of running a leader's office in extremely hostile circumstances. And they've reached out to many sort of policy experts and academics to help shape the program that hopefully they're going to start trying to push through in the new year. So I think it's that, sort of intellectual curiosity, focus on sort of finding leaders, focus on sort of diffusing their message to a mass audience, and then creating sort of new forms of political consciousness. All those things have been done in New York with spectacular results just the other week, and I think there's no reason why we couldn't hope to do them here.